Here's another beginner level video tutorial. And this time we will be creating these realistic looking tomatoes. And I've placed this tutorial under the beginner level tutorials, but it's a bit beginner to intermediate, I guess. But please just try it. I know you can do this. I will guide you through the process of creating this. And I think that drawing and painting food is a great way to study, to practice. Also, if your end goal is to create realistic portraits, then this is great exercise material. First of all, my canvas is 3000 by 4000 pixels. And the first thing we'll do is create a sketch. And if you are having trouble sketching, then do check out the sketching series here at Patreon. I am going to use the Flowtastic Sketcher. And I'll just use a dark gray, doesn't really matter. Now the base shape of a tomato, that's a circle, so that's pretty easy. We're going to sketch a circle for the tomato on the left. You can download the reference image through the post. You can download it at the bottom. Do be sure to use a browser instead of the Patreon app because it doesn't let you download attachments, unfortunately. So we have a circle for the tomato on the left, and then we have half a circle for that tomato slice. So these are pretty basic shapes. But I thought these tomatoes were great, a great exercise because of the texture, the shine that you see on the slice. Here we have the little stem. And here we have that stem on the tomato on the left. And it's just sticking out at the top here. And then we have these leaves sticking out a bit more. One is curving and almost touching that slice. And this one is curving in this direction to about the halfway point of the tomato. Try to measure things like that. Measure the distances you see. Then we have one more over here. Curving upwards a little bit. And another one next to it. In the end, I want to add a reflection at the bottom, so I'm placing them a little bit high up. I do feel I can, I can move them around a little bit. Let's go to the move tool. I'll put them a bit lower and I'll make them a little bit bigger. I guess something like this. Let's add these little leaves for this stem as well. Feel like it's a bit longer. And this one curving up here. So it's a nice rough sketch. You can sketch in that inside of the tomato a little bit. We got those seeds. I feel like this needs to go a little bit lower. And of course, if you feel like your sketch is a little bit too rough, if you want to refine it a bit more, then you can just lower the opacity of your sketch and make a new sketch on top. So you can make a new layer on top and lower the opacity here. Let's say to 24%. And then you can just use this sketch as a base for your more tidy sketch. So you can change some lines a little bit. Fix little things. And just overall make a clearer sketch. So I'll just follow these lines, making everything a little bit more tidy. Then I'll tidy up this tomato over here. Here we have some areas of shadow underneath those little leaves. And you don't have to sketch in all the little water droplets yet. We'll add those later in the painting process. So you don't have to think about those yet. You just need a sketch of your tomato and a tomato slice, and then you are ready to go. Now let me just merge these two. No, let me not merge them. I'm going to group them first for you so you can check my process. So this is step 1, the sketch. You can just open the file and take a closer look if you want. I'll duplicate this. You don't have to do this. I am going to merge these 2 layers. So this is the sketch. And then we are going to start coloring. Let me lower the opacity of the sketch first. I'll go to 21% and make a new layer on top. Then I'll place the sketch on top of that new layer. Well, let me rename this to step 2. And now first, I just want to lay down the base colors, the base shapes of these tomatoes. Let me grab a nice red. Perhaps something like this. I'll go to the illustration brushes and use the smooth lines. Let me check the size. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. Perhaps 60%. Yeah, that's nice. And I think the color is nice as well. So I'll drop it in the color palette. And now first I'm going to create the shape of this tomato. I'm going to follow the sketch. And don't worry, you can fix it a bit. I'm trying to follow that outline. Keep it pretty smooth. So you want to make a nice flowing line. Like that, and here it's covered by that other slice, so don't worry about that. Now you can just fill it so you have a nice tomato shape. And now I'll make a new layer for that other slice. So I'll click the plus for a new layer. And now let's pick a slightly darker color just so we can separate them. And now let's follow this shape. I'm going to make the brush a little bit smaller, 30%. And let's follow that sketch again. I'm actually going to turn my sketch a little bit. I find it easier to make this movement than the other way around. I'm making a nice flowing line. And then you can fill that shape. So you have that nice slice. We'll make that stem on a separate layer. Now by having these shapes on separate layers, we can use alpha lock and clipping mask layers to just paint on these shapes. So we will be able to paint on this tomato in the back without touching that one in the front. Now when I paint myself, I usually just put everything on one layer and mess around like that. But when you are a beginner, this way of working is a lot easier. Now let's create a layer for those stems. Let's click the plus and let's grab a green color. Going towards the yellows a little bit back. Perhaps something like this. And I am going to use the tapered lines brush. And I'll have to make it a bit bigger. Perhaps 40%, let me check. Yeah, that's nice. Now we can, I need to be faster. And I guess I need to make the brush a little bit smaller. I'm sorry, perhaps 10%? I think that's better. And now I'll follow the sketch again. And of course you don't have to get this like perfectly. Of course you can change it later. And long live the undo, of course. Alright, I think I have a closed shape here. Let me try to fill it. Yeah, that's nice. So now we are able to paint on this area without touching the tomato, and we can paint on the tomato without touching that stem. Let's add an outline to this one as well. And then drag in the color to fill it. And you can definitely change it a little bit, refine it. And you can definitely also still change it at a later stage. You want these leaves to be a little bit wobbly. If you look at the reference, you see that, well, that they are a little bit wobbly. So I'll just go over these, refining them a little bit Adding some little wobbles. And wobbles are easy, right? Alright, now we really have those base shapes. We have them down. Let's add that dark background. Let's click the plus for a new layer. I'm going to try to drag it to the bottom, but usually it drops out of the, drops out of the group. Yeah, now it's in the group. Let's just add a almost pure black background. Maybe a little bit reddish, a little bit off black, like that. Let me drop it in the color palette. All right, now let's get started on the lighting of this piece. Let me duplicate this group again. You don't have to do this. It's just so you can check the steps later. I am going to rename this to step 3. And we are going to use alpha lock on our layers, so we won't be able to paint outside of the shapes. Let's start with the tomato on the left. Let's click that layer and use alpha lock. And let's go to the illustration brushes. And we can actually use the make it darker brush. Let's pick a dark red. Maybe something like this. And I want to darken the right side of the tomato. Let me check first. Let's make the brush nice and big. Perhaps 66. Yes. Now look at the shadow areas on the tomato. Like that right side, that's very dark. And you can gradually darken that area up. Here at the bottom, it's also pretty dark. And at the same time, this brush is giving a little bit of texture. You can also see some shadow underneath that stem. And here, this area, that's really pretty dark. So I'm making multiple strokes there. Now let's make the brush a bit smaller. I'm at 25%. We'll make a bit of a shadow underneath these leaves. You can see a shadow here. And let's do the same thing for that other slice. Let's click that layer and turn alpha lock on. And let's darken this area, for instance. And here, this is also pretty dark. And every time you lift your pencil, it'll get charged again with like paint. And as long as you keep it on your screen, it'll have that same darkness. But every time you lift it and place it on your screen again, things will get darker. So just adding some global darkness. Don't have to be very precise about this, but it's also giving some variation here. Now I feel like the tomatoes, the colors are definitely more saturated. Let's go back to layer 6 and let's grab the overlay brush from the basic set. And let's grab a nice red, a nice saturated red. And let's go over our tomato, making it look more saturated. And perhaps some more orangey colors as well. Let's make the brush a bit smaller. It's at 12%. Now let's do the same for that slice. First I'll grab that red. And let's grab that yellow as well. this area. Now I want to add some texture. Let's go back to layer 6 and I'll go to the illustration brushes again. And let me use the spackle it brush. I can see some slight texture on the tomato, like these orangey specks. I feel like I can go a bit bigger with the brush, 60%, and perhaps lower the opacity a bit, 70%. And I'll just go over the tomato, adding some slight texture. Just in those light areas. You can add a little bit of that texture to layer 7 as well. Over here at the top, that's pretty light there. So we can add some base texture. And let's go back to layer 6 and let's do the same with a very dark color. Let me grab this shadow color and let me drop it in. And we can add some dark spackles here at the bottom. And we can make the brush smaller, 20%, to add a little bit here underneath that stem as well. And next, let's do something similar for the stem. Let's go to layer 8 and set this to alpha lock as well. And first, let's go to the make it darker brush again. And let me just pick that local color first, make it a little bit darker. I'll drop it in. And for instance, let's darken this right side of that stem here. I'll make the brush a bit smaller, 8%. Let's darken that up a little bit. It's pretty dark, as you can see, and we have this little like hole. Here we have some dark spots. Just focus on those darkest areas. You can add a little line here, for instance. You can see that dark line. You can vary the size of your brush to add a little bit of that texture. You can see it's pretty dark where it's folding a little bit. And here, that underside of those leaves of that stem. There's a lot of shadow there. You can go a little bit smaller. I'm at 5% right now. Just slowly adding some texture. And we can do the same for, we'll have to be on the same layer. Layer 8 has this stem as well. Let's do it here as well. Let's darken it up a little bit. Here, that underside of this leaf is also pretty dark. And with this make it darker brush, you can slowly build that up. Let's make it a bit bigger, 16% for this area. And I feel like we can add some vibrance here as well. So let's go to the overlay brush again. I'll pick a nice bright green. And let's go over just in some areas, add a little bit of oomph. Now I'll go back to the illustration brushes again and let's use the grunge rock brush. Let me grab that dark color again. Let's see. Yeah, let's just add a little bit of texture. I'm at 50%. Opacity is at 40. I just want to add some more texture. And here as well. It'll just add some variation and interest. And once you have done this, it is already starting to look more like a realistic looking tomato. It's starting to take shape. Let me duplicate the group again for you so you can check the steps in the file. I'll call this step 4. And I want to work on lighter details. Let's go and grab the Make It Lighter brush. And perhaps we can start with this color. Let's go to 20%. For instance, here, I see a lighter area on that tomato. I'll go even bigger, 43%. I'm making circular motions, slightly lightening that up. Make it smaller again, just play around with that size. Just looking at those lightest areas. Then I'll go to layer 7. You can definitely add more light there as well. And now let's grab a very light color. Maybe a bit bluish. Let me check. We'll go to layer 6. And I'm at 15%. And let's add some of those very bright highlights. You have one here near that edge. Go even smaller with my brush, 11%. I'll just go along that edge. Slowly building up that light. Can play around with the size of the brush. Sometimes you'll need to make it a little bit bigger. You have a pretty bright highlight over here. I have to go bigger with my brush. And a little one here at the bottom. Very subtle. So just play around with the brush size and adjust it. If needed, here we need a little bit of a smaller highlight. And now let's go to that other tomato, layer 7. And let's lighten up this area, for instance. Look at the reference image and check where you see those brightest areas. Don't lighten it up too much because we want to add some more specular highlights here to add that shine here. So don't go too light. Let's go for something like this. Now let's do this for the stems as well. So we'll go to layer 8 and let's add some highlights here as well. Let's make the brush smaller, 10%. Perhaps even smaller. I want to go even smaller, 4%. Just add some of these highlights, for instance, near this little edge. And you can add some more texture, some of these lines. Some more lines here as well. Just a little texture. And on this stem, add some light too. Doing great, really starting to look like real tomatoes. Let me check. Let's go to the Flotastic brushes. And let's, let's go to the basic set. Let's switch to the basic flow brush. I want to add these little like seeds. They are a little bit yellowish. Perhaps we can just grab this color. Let's go to layer 7 where we have that slice. And the brush, I have it at 25%. Opacity is at 100%. And let's create these little ovals for these seeds. Just some relatively simple oval shapes. You can see some yellow shining through here, so I'll add a little bit of that orangey here. And at this point, I think we can actually turn off the sketch. We don't need that anymore. And let me duplicate this step again. Let's check what we just did. We added those highlights and it really adds to the realism of your tomato. I'm going to duplicate it. I'm going to call it 5. Like I said, no need to do this unless you want to save your process and you're afraid you might mess it up in the next stage, then you can do that. Let's go back to this layer 6, and now we are going to the Flotastic brushes. And now that we have this base and we have this texture, it's easy to refine it using the Flotastic brushes. For instance, we can use the Flow Darker brush and we can work on the shadows a bit more. We can use that local color. Let me check the size. I have it at 38% and the opacity is at 50%. And you can use this brush to darken areas up. I'm going to refine this shadow a little bit. Just like this shadow over here. And with this brush, as long as you work on the layer where the colors are on, you can easily darken areas up without messing with the texture that you've already created. And you can just gradually add shadows. For instance, we have a little bit of shadow underneath this leaf here. You can just go over these areas, check if you need to darken your shadow a bit. I feel like we can darken this area a little bit more. It's almost merging with the background there. You can barely see that edge of the tomato. So it's nice to darken that up a little bit. Just like this area underneath here. It's also pretty dark and almost merging with that stem area. And its shadow is darkest near the stem, and then it fades a bit as it moves to those ends of the leaves. You can make the brush a bit bigger, 66. You can darken this area a little bit more. And this lower area. You can just use this to refine everything a little bit. We are really in the refining phase here. And you can do the same thing with the Flow lighter brush, for instance. We can pick this local color here. I have it at 37%. Size is at 26, but we can play around with that. I want to make it bigger, 69. You can lighten some areas up. For instance, this area is very bright. So only for those brightest highlights, I'm going to add a little bit here. Now let me grab the local red color. I'm going to lower the opacity a bit, 50%. And here we have a very slight lighter edge here at the bottom. If you look at the reference, you can see it. That adds a nice touch. I think it's starting to look delicious, even though I don't like tomatoes. Now let's go to the one on the right. Layer 7. Let's start with the Flow darker brush again. And I'll stick with this color. And let's darken this area a little bit, for instance. I feel like it needs to be a bit darker. It's pretty close almost to that background color. This area is also a bit darker. Now, like I said, you can duplicate your layer or your entire group if you are afraid you might mess things up. But do be sure to work on the layer where the colors are on. So don't go making a new layer, because then the Flow darker brush won't work. Now here we have some pretty dark areas between these seeds and a pretty clear edge. Clear distinction between that very moist area and the little less moist area. And that's something I can't stress enough. Look at the edges. Look at where you see crisp edges and where you see more gradual transitions. For instance, for this tomato, it's great that we created a base shape with a very crisp outline and that we are using the alpha lock so that line, it remains crisp, because when you look at the outline of the tomato, it has a very crisp edge. And keeping it that way, that really adds to the realism. While a kiwi fruit, for instance, would have a bit more of a fuzzy outline probably, because it's so, yeah, well, it's a bit hairy. So that is really something to keep in mind. And if you are having trouble with edges and values and transitions of areas, then try doing the value exercise that I have shared a while back. It's a great exercise. And if you feel like you're losing a bit of that vibrance, which I am feeling, then you can go to the basic set again, use the overlay brush, set it to that bright red, and go over the areas to add a little bit of brightness. Now I want to go to that flow lighter brush, and let's go for a very light reddish color, pinkish. And now let's add some highlights. I want to go for a more bluish, brighter color. Maybe something like this. Let me drop it in for you. I think we need an orangey light here. I'll pick that orange. And let's pick the red for a very slight light outline here. Now to get that those very crisp light lines, you can use the light and line brush. Let me grab this local color. We make it a bit bigger. 18% opacity is at 80%. And you can use this to, well, I'm gonna go even bigger. 40%. You can use this to add these very crisp looking highlights. Let me go and grab that bluish color. But you could actually also use that, perhaps we'll use that. You can use that makeup brush. Not sure if you followed that tutorial with the glossy lips, but that highlighter brush, that is great for these kinds of highlights. These are a bit the same as those highlights on the lips. But adding these crisp highlights with pretty crisp edges, that's what's adding that gloss, that feeling that it's very moist. This is what adds, I'm losing my words. This adds to that look. This is what makes it look realistic and glossy. Moist things have these glossy, crisp highlights. Just go along all these areas where you see these crisp highlights. Let's just go to those makeup brushes. Let's use that wet subtle gloss. You can go over that area and blur it a little bit. It's set to 60% opacity and 20% in size. If you hold your pen on the screen, it'll get a little bit watery. And you can blend these areas. If you hold it on your screen, every time you let go and put it on back on your screen, it'll get charged with a little bit more paint again. But this brush is great for these wet, glossy highlights. Now here in this area we got quite some little highlights. Let's make some dabs here. Just little dabs of highlights. Now let's go back to the Flotastic brushes and that light and line brush. For just some little, I'll go bigger with the brush, 75% for just some little bright highlights. We can actually also go to the illustration brushes and just use the rough spackles, for instance. Let's go a bit smaller, 50%. No, smaller, 30. And we can go over this area and use those spackles to create the idea of these little highlights. Go even smaller. Let's go for 10% for this area over here. And some over here as well. And if you feel like it's getting a bit too spackly, then you can grab a blender brush. For instance, you could just use the standard blender from the basic set and go over the area. And you could soften some things a little bit in case you feel like it's too much. Now let's add some more definition to those stems. Let's go to layer 8. We'll keep using the Flotastic brushes. And let's use the darken line brush right now. I'll grab the local color. And the opacity is at 75% and the size is at 40%. And I'll define the dark areas a bit more, like this inside of the stem. You can use this brush to add tiny little details that are dark. For instance, you can add a bit more to that texture. Add some more lines. And just keep looking at where you see crisp edges, where you see these very dark areas. And let's do the same on this side. Here we can see that edge that's a little bit darker. I'm keeping it a bit textured, so I'm using little dabs as well and some lines. Let's add some lines to this little leaf. And let's do the same with the lighten line to add some lighter touches. I'll grab a very light green and I will go over these very light areas. And for instance, you can add these like tiny little, they almost seem like hairs. I'll make the brush a bit smaller, 33%. And if you want those hairs to stick out outside of the shape, then you'll have to turn off alpha lock. I'll keep it turned on for now. But if you want to add even more details to your tomato, then you can turn that off eventually and add some of those little tiny hairs sticking out. Just adding a little bit of texture. Giving that suggestion of detail, of realism. You don't have to follow that reference exactly. I think this is looking nice. You could keep it like this if you just want the tomatoes and you feel like droplets are too big of a challenge. You can just stop here. Or you can continue and add droplets with me. Or you can skip ahead and add that reflection to the bottom, because we'll be doing that as well. But for now, let me duplicate this group again for that final touch to add those droplets. We are going to add droplets on a separate layer, but I'll do it on a layer underneath those leaves. Click the plus for the new layer. And also let me drop it underneath that slice, because we will only be adding droplets to that tomato on the left. Well, first thing I am going to do is go to the illustration brushes and let's use the smooth lines. And now let's pick a local color. Let's go for a pretty dark one. Let's do this. Now we are just going to make the circles and the ovals, the shapes for our droplets. That's the first step. Let me check the size of the brush. Well, that's okay actually. Well, maybe it's a bit big. Let's go smaller, 10%. And I just want to create the shapes of the droplets. I don't know how I created the droplets last time. but there are many ways to create droplets. Many roads leading to Rome. I know we did droplets in the cherry tutorial. But like I said, I don't know what technique I used in that one. So if you find this technique too hard, you can always just check out that video and try out that technique. But now just focus on the shapes of the droplets. Make sure they are nice and smooth, though they can be a little bit wobbly. And I'm not going to add the same amount as I'm seeing in the reference image. Of course you can, but I feel like it is going to take too much time if I do them all. So let's just do quite a bunch. Alright, now let me set this layer to multiply. And I'm going to lower the opacity a bit. Something like this. It looks really weird right now. I'm going to click the layer, then use select, and then make a new layer on top. And I'm going to fill it with a nice bright yellow. Let's go and use the color fill option here. So everything is filled all at once. And let's set this to screen. And then click the layer and select mask. And we're going to fill this mask with black. We have pure black here. Let's fill it. And now let's go to that mask and let's use the basic flow brush and set it to white. Now we can go along these edges and lighten those up. Make the brush a bit bigger, 43%. Well, that's too big for those smaller ones. 18% then. I'm just focusing on that lower part of all these droplets. Create very, very basic droplets. Now we are going to add a layer underneath those droplets. So first we'll click layer 6, then click the plus, and we will set this layer to multiply. Let's pick a local color. We're still using the basic flow brush. I'm at 10%. And again, we'll continue. We'll focus on the lower edge and add a little bit of a shadow underneath those droplets. Go even bigger, 15%. Depending on how big the droplet is. Or go smaller again, 8%. Just go along the edge of all of these droplets, adding that little shadow. Now I want to add even brighter highlights. Let's make a selection again. Let's click that layer with the droplets. Use select. Then I'll make a new layer on top. I'm sorry, I think the color's changed. But I actually kind of liked it. Let me check. Select. It's a bit more subtle, but I kind of like it. Alright. Yeah, it's a bit more reddish now. I like that. It was a happy little accident. Let me go for select again. Now we have a selection now that I have turned off color fill. Let's make a new layer on top. And while I have the selection active, I want to add highlights. I will do that by just using the basic flow brush. I'll pick this color. It's at 4%. And let's add highlights to these droplets. And you can also add little highlights to the edges in some areas. But with the basic flow brush, you can slowly build these highlights up. Make little ones for the little droplets. You can add a glowing little edge to the bottom. So a little highlight at the top and then a little glowy at the bottom. Just look at those that reference image, those droplets, try to mimic that. But having this selection active gives you the ability to make these really crisp looking edges. And that's what's adding to the realism of these droplets. They have very sharp edges. So again, edges, edges, edges. You might get tired of me telling about edges, but it's just really important. Just go along all the droplets. I think I have them all. And of course, you can tweak some things. You can add, for instance, a little bit of orangey. You make the brush a bit bigger, 7%. I feel like we can use a little bit of orangey here. And in this. But you can also darken some of the droplets. We can pick this very dark red, for instance. And while we have the selection active, just don't go over the highlights you just created. You can add a little bit of a dark edge as well where it's needed. But that's the great thing about having that base layer with with those droplets, just those base shapes. You can always go back to that, make a selection, and then tweak things. Super easy. Let me grab a more reddish. You can just continue tweaking it and you just have those shapes. You have that selection, keeping everything nice and crisp. I just want to add a little bit of color vibrance to those droplets. So a way to do that is by creating a new layer again, while making a selection of the droplets. So we'll click that layer, use select, then go to this layer and I'll set it to overlay. And then we can use an airbrush, we can use a soft brush, and let's use that orange. And we can go over the droplets and see we are adding a lot of vibrance here, a bit too much. Let's use that red as well. Just a little bit of vibrance, a bit too much, but that's okay because we can just use the slider and lower the opacity. Keeping that vibrance, but making it a bit more subtle. We can go for 30%. I think it'll look even cooler with more droplets, so go ahead and add more. I'm just going to skip ahead and make that reflection. To make that reflection, we will need a merged version of these tomatoes. Let me first just duplicate this. Again, you don't have to do this. I might be able to make more layers than you are, but I just want to save this. So let me merge all of these layers. So now we have the tomatoes on one layer and we can easily duplicate it. Oh, by the way, if you are doing this, if you are merging them, do make sure that you make a backup, because once you have merged them, there's no way to unmerge them once you go out of your file. All right, so we have a merged version. Let's go to that bottom one. And then let's go to the arrow, to the move tool and use flip vertical. Then make sure that you have magnetics turned on. Snapping is not necessary. And then let's move it down. Now let me distort it a little bit so that the bottom here touches the tomato. Let me go up a little bit. So you want that bottom part of this tomato to touch the bottom of the real one. Something like this is nice. It's very, very subtle, that reflection, so don't worry about it too much. Go for something like this, then click the arrow again. And now we are going to lower the opacity of this layer drastically. For instance, to 20%. Then we are going to add a layer mask. Click the layer, then click mask. And let's drop in black. So now it's gone. But then when we have the mask selected, we can use the soft brush. Set it to white. We can go for 60% opacity, for instance. I'm at 40% size. And then you can paint that reflection back in very subtly. And now you have a very subtle reflection, as if our tomatoes are standing on a reflective surface. I hope you have enjoyed following this tutorial. I'd really recommend exercising a lot with painting food. I just love painting food, and it's just a great exercise. If painting portraits is your end goal, then I feel that doing this is really a good idea, because you are practicing with edges, with transitions, with values, adding texture. So I'm looking forward to seeing your results. I'm sure I'll see a lot of awesome tomatoes and perhaps other types of fruit and vegetables as well. And I will see you next time for the next tutorial, and I'll talk to you here at Patreon.